not every human thought is a good one. So why then should we throw out everything from the past?
Blood is thicker than water.
People have always been saying that the world is ending, right? And it has never ended.
They will be saying it right before it does.
Imagining that anything is possible in the future is a mistake of, honestly, liberalism.
I want to end on a hopeful note.
Our addiction to growth leads to genocide.
We're done until and unless we find a new planet, which will have all sorts of problems of its own.
And so the point is there an afterlife? Kind of.
Ladies and gents, it is my great pleasure to welcome today with us two evolutionary biologists, and at least in my view, one of the most original thinkers in the world today. Please welcome Dr. Bret Weinstein and Dr. Heather Haying. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Adam.
And just to let you know, we just published their book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. And I would definitely recommend to anybody to have a look at it, because it is full of insights that I haven't seen anywhere before, and it's definitely worth a read. Now, some of you may be surprised that we're actually publishing a book like this, because normally we focus on issues connected to democracy, elections, free speech, and so on. But as I've been mentioning just a little while ago, whenever we're talking about democracy, we have to realize that there's the word demos, right? It is linked to the nature of how people behave, how they think, how they react to things. And since we have two Americans here, I would quote the Federalist Papers, who said that, what is government itself, but the greatest of all reflections on human nature. So I think this book really brings us back to first principles and to a more reasonable and constructive way how to talk and think about human nature. So, and that leads me to my first question, because there was one thing that really I found quite striking in your book, because you talk about the specialty of the human niche. And perhaps, would you mind explaining what exactly a niche is in evolutionary biology, and what's so special about humans in this regard?
The way to think about, we would pronounce it probably niche. Niche is perfectly correct, but...
I double-checked, it's a British-American thing.
Oh, is that right? I didn't realize that. Yeah. A niche is an opportunity. So you could imagine that a niche might be a particular valley with a particular set of ecological parameters that was hospitable to some creature that had the correct tools to exploit it. It is useful. We have a metaphor in evolutionary biology, the adaptive landscape, in which opportunities are represented as mountain peaks, and obstacles to moving from one to the other are represented as valleys. It's a very useful metaphor, and Heather and I use it in an upgraded form. It was originally formulated in 1932, and it was a very tightly genetic analogy. It makes sense to broaden it to think about things like human culture, which are absolutely evolutionary in the same terms, but it is also useful to think of these mountains not as surfaces, but as volumes. A niche is a mountain peak, and it fills up with creatures. As a creature discovers an opportunity, they reproduce until that opportunity is fully exploited, at which point they reach what we call carrying capacity, which is the population that can be supported by that opportunity.
All right. And when it comes to humans, what is the human niche?
Well,
niche.
This is a very important little mental upgrade, because what I've just described is a world in which niches are a pretty good match for species, right? When we say, what is a kookaburra, we're describing a bird that has a particular set of requirements and a particular set of strengths, and we will find that bird every place that it can get to that has those characteristics. Humans are not like this. Human populations are more like species. You can have people exploiting, for example, marine mammals. This is a very difficult way of existing ecologically. Hunting large marine mammals is a very dangerous job. It is very difficult to land them successfully, so it requires a tremendous amount of specialization. If you take a person from a population that has been hunting marine mammals and you move them to a valley, 20 kilometers away on land where there are terrestrial mammals, this person will be close to helpless. Mm-hmm. They will not have the skills to do it. And so what the key insight is that human beings have two kinds of heritable evolutionary information. One is genetic, like all other creatures. The other is cultural. And what happens is a cultural package of instructions and skills is passed along that can take a human being who is physiologically and morphologically like all other human beings, and it can give them the specialty that allows them to inhabit a totally different niche from their neighbor. So the human niche, we say in the book, is niche switching. Humans are specialized on moving from one niche to the next, and no other species can say that.
Other species have flexibility. They may be generalists, which allows them to move somewhat between spaces. But we are best. We are best on the planet, and we argue this is what makes us, this is what has led us to be dominant on the planet, that our ability to each be specialists in our own way, and most of us have multiple specialties, means that while individuals may be specialists, as a species we are generalist. And that is a distinction that no other organism on the planet, no other species on the planet has managed.
Does that also mean that we come into the world, children come into the world with no predefined specialization, but they acquire it through development from their culture and from the opportunities that they have around them? Can it also mean that since we can become virtually anything, does that entail the danger that we can become nothing?
Yes, as we argue in the book, we are not blank slates. This was an error.
Yeah.
But we are the blankest slates of any species that is out there. We have the most potential at birth to become any other thing that humanity can become than any other species could say. A dragonfly is born and its fate is sealed.
Right.
Even a chimpanzee is born and its fate is more sealed than that of a human. And so, all humans, barring extraordinarily rare developmental problems, have the capacity for language at birth. But what language it is that they will learn is dependent entirely on the environment in which they find themselves. And so we know that a baby born into a family of Han Chinese, if taken from their birth parents and their birth culture and moved into a family of Czech speakers, will learn Czech. Without any problems at all. And there is nothing in the palate, in the brain, in the laryngeal structure of that baby that prevents that baby from speaking Czech just as well as she would have spoken Mandarin. So the capacity for language is universal, and the particularities that we end up having as adults are almost entirely driven by what we are exposed to and what we are allowed to experience and learn as children.
I would add one thing to this, which is, as far as we can tell, cognitively speaking, we are effectively equivalent. The software packages vary based on the niches that our ancestors have inhabited, but this becomes less true physiologically. If you were to take an Inuit, a person who's lived in the Arctic, and you were to move them to the Kalahari Desert, they would be profoundly handicapped by some very obvious things. For one thing, Inuits, because they live in an environment where the loss of heat is a danger, because it requires the finding of more food to burn more heat, they have a rounder form, because it minimizes the surface area that's in contact with the world. That is the adaptive form. In the Kalahari, people look the opposite. They are very long and lean, and the reason is because getting rid of heat is the way to survive. having more surface area per unit of volume is the key challenge to overcome. And so it is not that there are not distinctions that are predispose one to success in one environment versus another, but it's that this is not in the realm of the hardware that runs the software. It is the hardware that does the physical work, which has been specialized for different environments.
But let me just add one more example of a case where our differences that are visible on the outside, phenotypically, actually do affect modern life. And while we are, as we've already made clear, staunch defenders of the idea that people have the capacity to be just about anything at birth, and it depends on what environment you end up having them in. Something like where your ancestors hailed from, and therefore to what degree you tend to be rounder versus taller and leaner, is going to be dependent on the climate in which your peoples have their history, but so too skin color. And so this manifests in a way that is actually important for individual and therefore public health, wherein the darker your skin, the more protected you are against the sun, and therefore the less likely to get skin cancer. But that means that you are less able to synthesize vitamin D from the sun. And so darker skinned peoples tended to have their more recent history closer to the equator. And lighter skinned people tend to have their more recent history farther from the equator. Lighter skinned people are thus better able to synthesize vitamin D from the sun and less likely to be vitamin D deficient, which has all sorts of important health effects. The farther you are from the equator, in combination with the darker your skin color, the more likely you are to suffer health effects from not having enough vitamin D. And so this is something that everyone should know. Right. And it is there is nothing else that inherently follows from that. Just if your skin is dark, you are probably less likely to have enough vitamin D, and therefore you may be suffering from chronic diseases that you could solve through a variety of means, including traveling to a place where you could synthesize more vitamin D during the cold times in the winter when the sun is low in the sky, and or supplementing or saunas of particular types. So there are differences between people, to be sure, that have effects, and they are generally not the ones that people talk about when they talk about differences between populations.
Right. It has also become taboo, in our country at least, to speak in these terms. That every time one finds a distinction in how well a population is faring, that distinction is attributed to oppression. And of course, sometimes it is the result of oppression. But as the case Heather points to makes clear, sometimes it is the result of an arbitrary physiological difference where a population has been moved from an ancestral habitat to one that has different characteristics. And it would obviously be in everyone's interest to recognize the physiological implications of these distinctions and talk about them in dispassionate terms so that everybody knows how best to maintain their health.
I mean, I have a sort of a bias due to my training as a psychologist. So I wanted to touch with this next question a bit more on the cognitive or the psychological part of it, because it seems to me that if it is the case that the human niche is niche switching, we should, at least I would expect that we would have a sort of readiness towards finding our particular place in the world. And one thing that I was reminded of when I was reading a book was an article that I read about depression, and one particular way that depression is interpreted is it's interpreted as a sort of severing of the relationship between the person and the world. So the person doesn't feel like they belong to the world. They can't actually, when they look to the world, they don't see relevance. The world doesn't speak back to them. The glass doesn't invite people to drink from it. The chair doesn't invite them to sit on it, and so on. And I was wondering what you think about that, because it seems like the niche finding or trying to find our place in the world is not done via a mere consumption of information on the internet or via verbal instruction. There needs to be an active interaction with the environment that then guides people, which is then supported by findings such as, more physical exercise is actually beneficial when people have depression or anxiety, and so on. Does that make sense that this is something that we are perhaps underestimating in modern society, because we're sort of leaning more towards on the passive top-down instruction way of teaching rather than on an actual interaction and trying things out for ourselves?
Very much so, at so many levels. We misunderstand ourselves as passive, and as consumers, and as things that have bodies that the world happens to, as opposed to embodied sensory beings that interact with the world and in so doing change what the world actually says back to us. And this error is, of course, facilitated by being inside a lot and receiving our apparently human interaction through screens, and we just have no way to have a conversation with a screen when it is information that has been produced at some other moment. And so this is, we argue in the book, going to be particularly chaos-inducing for children. If parents, if caregivers say, okay, I can't deal with the child right now, I'm going to use as a babysitter a game, an animated thing, something that to put in front of the child such that they can just be engaged with that for 20 minutes, 2 hours, whatever it is. But if the thing that the child is sitting in front of is anything like a humanoid form, anything from humans to animated figures, and the child responds to a joke, something that happens, and tries to engage with what is on screen, because that is what people do, because we are social, because we are social and long-lived, and we have generational overlap, and so this is what we do, is we interact. If you start telling a child early on that the things that look like you should be interacting with them can't interact, don't interact, won't interact, and they don't know the distinction between those, can't, won't, the child will begin to sense that the world is a place that does not respond. And so we have, especially now, a generation coming up that feels that the world does not respond and is by turns depressed, angry, sad, has given up, right? And none of those responses are out of phase with their experience that actually the world is not responding to them. And this can change. It's harder, the older you get, the more your life has been one without interaction with the world, the harder it is to prove to yourself that the world will respond. But it can be done by interacting with real people and going out into the world and having real physical experiences that cannot lie to you about what it is that you've done. Did you just miss a step and fall a little bit on your way downstairs? That was the world informing you of its reality and reminding you that actually you are real and interacting in it.
So I would add a couple things. We have, first of all, the book is called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, but we might have called it hyper-novelty. That term is fundamental, and what it means is that although human beings, because niche switching is our niche, are the fastest adapting creature that has ever existed, nonetheless, we have created an environment that is changing so rapidly because of technology that even our incredible capacity to adapt is far outstripped by the rate of change of the world around us. So Heather points to the fact that people sit in front of screens passively, and it might be particularly dangerous. If you're watching a cartoon, you know it doesn't look like the real world. A child might be able to segregate. The cartoons don't interact, but the people do. But many of the things on the screen are people. Right. They look like they're sitting in your living room, and yet they do not respond when you smile at them. So this creates a very dangerous lesson in the mind that has powerful implications. But at the same time, as kids grow up and they spend more and more time online interacting with each other, they are over-reified. They too early find that the world can react tremendously to something that they do. If they say something incendiary or something that particularly galvanizes their friends, it feels like suddenly they've done something important. And that's not really true. It takes a while to know enough to do something important. And so Both of these things are misinformative and in opposite directions. And I think the overarching lesson, which is really a major theme of our book, is we cannot really rely on any complex interaction with the world that has not already stood the test of time. Doesn't mean that all of the things that are new are bad, but we don't know what their impact is until they have existed long enough and we have carefully watched enough to know what they mean. And you can see this in things as mundane as a light bulb. It happens that incandescent bulbs used to be tremendously wasteful, or so we thought, because they put out a large amount of energy that is not useful. It doesn't do the job of lighting the space, which is why we designed the light bulb in the first place. So we have now got much better light bulbs from a point of view of efficiency, that put out only light in the spectrum that we actually needed. And it turns out that this is actually a health hazard, because lots of the other parts of the spectrum from a tungsten bulb happens to mirror what goes on with the sun. And because we have stepped inside out of the sun, we've actually interrupted our own physiology, and the light bulb was doing some part of the job of making it better, and now we've become so focused on doing the one thing that we think the light bulb is for that it is now making us sicker again. So the real point is, I don't know why it makes sense to go take a walk outside, right? I can't name all the reasons. Probably we will never know all of the reasons. But that it is good for you is something we intuitively feel. And the point is, there is undoubtedly a deep logic to why it is good for you, even if we can't spell it out.
Let me just add that one of the themes of the book is a rejection of reductionism. That we are scientists, and in the modern era, many people, including many scientists, mistake science as a kind of reductionism. It's as if it celebrates reductionism. The thing that you can measure, the thing that you can quantify, the metrics are what we are shooting for. And in fact, what this does is put us at risk of missing what the right questions are, and therefore what the actual answers are. And so we see this with regard to, we've already brought up a few of them, with regard to, the sun is bad, and therefore you need to cover yourself and never get the sun on your skin. Well, then you're going to risk vitamin D deficiency, among other things. That's just one of the answers that we now know to why protecting yourself fully from the sun is a bad idea. Similarly, the idea of screens as a replacement, of being inside as a way to keep yourself comfortable. We've moved into climates where it would be very uncomfortable to try to do our work outside all year round, right? Most of the work that many humans do wouldn't be doable outside in many seasons, in many climates that we work in. But that doesn't mean that we should be spending all of our time inside. What are we missing? We don't know. And we can name some of the things, but the request that we name all of the things that we will lose when we reduce the value of something that is complex and ancient and has been with us our entire evolutionary history, not just going back to our split with chimpanzees 6 million years ago, but our entire billions of years history, suggest no, we don't need to answer all of those questions to say, take that out at your peril. And so this, and we invoke Chesterton's fence. That's right. Where Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, in the early 20th century, created this little parable about two people walking in a field and come across a fence. And one of them says, "This fence is in the way, I want to get rid of it." And the other says, "Until you know what the fence is for, you do not get rid of it." And it is sort of a flip side of the precautionary principle, where we are running into too many things, too many pieces of evidence now where we have gotten rid of things that we should not have gotten rid of. Chesterton's organs, right? The appendix. Chesterton's breast milk, with regard to imagining that it's only food that babies need and therefore formula is fine. Chesterton's everything at some level with regard to the hyper-novelty of our modern world. And it's not that progress isn't necessary and valuable and amazing in places. But we have taken some terrific successes and generalized to imagine that anything that seems to make our life easier will be better. And very often we end up worse off for it.
I would just point out, we have obsessed as a society about reductionism, and it is a terrible error. It is destructive of science. But that does not mean that reductionism is not a component of science. It's just like imagining that the engine is the car. The engine is not the car. Reductionism is a component that has to fit with theory, which tells you which experiments to run, and then it has a flip side. And interestingly, we can all name reductionism, and very few people have asked what is its partner, could tell you that the partner is synthesis. That what we do is we take all of the things we have discovered in this zoomed in form, and then we try to understand what they are telling us about their interaction. And this is especially important in any realm that is biological, where you're dealing with something so complex, you cannot understand it as a whole until you've looked at enough parts that you can begin to describe their interaction. So our book is a work of synthesis, and to the extent that that university science believes that it has moved on from anything, and you will hear people make claims that sound right. They say, data is king, data-driven science. It sounds like what they're saying is science must be grounded in the empirical, but that's not what they're saying. They are describing a misformed notion of science in which this one component has been divorced from all the others.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me foolish to be collecting data if you don't have a good question, and the reality that we place such an emphasis on constant data collection, and at least to me it seems like there is too little attention being paid on proper and good hypotheses.
And indeed, it's not data if it comes before the hypothesis.
Right.
It's observation, and it's necessary perhaps.
Right.
Valuable if it allows you to see the beginnings of intimate some pattern that you have not yet tested, and then form the hypothesis, and then go out and collect what is actually data. But exactly as you say, all too often the so-called data collection happens first, and then it is fitted to an explanation, and that is perhaps a piece of the scientific process, but no hypothesis has been tested, and therefore you don't have results that have been tested.
Well, worse, it is described as if the hypothesis pre-existed, which is a fatal violation of the most significant piece of the philosophy of science that makes the method work. Right? It's actually fraud. So we have to get past this, and people have to understand that the reason that the world has become focused this way and pretends that reductionism is the core and that we've somehow matured past theory and synthesis and all of this has a very mundane economic explanation. It has to do with the way universities are funded. It has nothing to do with the way proper science is done, and never did. So in any case, all of these components have to work together, and anytime somebody's thrown one out, if they claim that they're doing science, they're not.
Yeah. Actually, I love the term harking, hypothesizing after results are known. And and hopefully people are starting to recognize it, because in psychology we had the replication crisis, which was scandalous in 2014. And a couple of years ago there was actually an article that said that it's not just a problem of methodology or data analysis. I think it was Joseph Henrich who said that it's a problem of the fact that we don't have good theory. Because when a physicist measures a neutrino that travels faster than light, there's a red blinker that says something's not right, and they double check the results. But since we don't have good theory, anything goes, because you don't know whether it fits in, the grand canopy of scientific theory building, because you don't have one. Yeah.
Yes, and the amount of harm that comes from this error, it's not. We are early in the study of psychology, and we should recognize how little we know, and the fact that there is no checksum that would allow you to detect that you had come up with a result that didn't really make sense means that we have, for example, spent decades treating people for serious mental disorders on the basis of a quote-unquote theory that is in fact false, which is that most of them are suffering from some sort of chemical imbalance, which would of course explain why we are giving them a pill to cure an error of cognition.
They're disappearing now, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
But how many?
For a long time, that was the case.
How many people were harmed because we didn't have because the philosophy of science undergirding our understanding of the condition was simply invalid.
I want to come back to reductionism for a bit more, because it almost seems quite ironic, because I've been a fan of evolutionary theory for a long time. I to be fair, I don't know anything scientifically that would be as elegant when it comes to the breadth of explanation that it provides and the amount of insight that it provides. But when I've been talking about evolutionary theory in the context of human behavior, the most common reaction that I got was that it was being too reductionistic, right? And now your evolutionary biologists, talking about human behavior, even talking about societal processes, but you'll go against reductionism. What would you reply to that critique?
There's so many things here.
Yeah, I think the simple thing is, most of what motivates that critique, I believe, is an earnest fear of what will be discovered if we point these tools at human beings. Right. Now, it happens, I think the answers could be absolutely dire, but they aren't. We got lucky. If you do this carefully, if you do the work carefully, and you work from a theoretical perspective, and then you work towards synthesis, the answers you find, it's not that they don't create difficulties. There's some problems that are truly wicked, but few, and they are not the ones people are most concerned about. So in some ways, this makes no difference. Scientifically speaking, it's not that there are questions that you're allowed to ask. There are just simply questions. And we should follow the answers to wherever they are, because the likelihood of finding solutions, if we are informed, is higher. But what other tool are you going to use? The fact is, anytime we look at expensive structures in any creature, we intuitively understand that we are looking at a product of evolution, a product of adaptation. To exclude human beings from this is the most fundamental violation of what we have already come to understand.
I think most people who would exclude human behavior from an evolutionary analysis would grant you that the bodies are evolved, right? And so the way that this is often described is that evolution stopped at the neck, right? That all evolution from the neck down, sure, we get that. But up here, well, that's something else. And when you frame it that way, it becomes clear that it's effectively a religious viewpoint, right? And it can come in the language of, oh, well, that's reductionist. You can't possibly know enough. But actually, we are trying to apply the same tools to an understanding of what humans are at the behavioral level as we do to understanding what hummingbirds are at the behavioral level, and to what humans are at the physiological and anatomical level. And then I would just also invoke, we are certainly not the first people to do this, the naturalistic fallacy, which is that we are seeking to understand what we are, what humans are and what humans have been, and what, therefore, our history has to say about what we can become. But what we are is natural, but that doesn't make it good. And so we argue, and again others have as well, that understanding what we are evolutionarily is actually maybe not the only, but I think it might be, but certainly the best route to then understanding how to reframe humanity such that we do not act on our worst evolutionary instincts. Like, we need to understand what we are evolutionarily. Pretending that we're not evolutionary, saying, oh, that's reductionist, we can't go there, actually paves the way for really ugly things to emerge in human societies. Whereas if we understand, we emerge from organisms and from our own societies that have engaged in atrocities and also extreme beauty. Genocide and rape are products of human evolution, and so is a mother's love and patriotism. All of those things are the result of evolution. And once we understand that, we can begin to think about how to work to decrease the one and increase the other.
Yes. evolution is inherently an amoral process. Right. And if we are not to be amoral creatures, we are going to have to pick among its products as they apply to us and pick the good ones. There is an error in the early understanding of evolution that is actually responsible for people's failure to grasp the degree to which human culture is evolutionary, which is that Darwin talked vaguely about heritability. Because he didn't know about what took place inside the cells. He did not know about genes. He didn't know about Mendel's work, though they were contemporaries. But the problem is that when the genetic mechanism of inheritance was discovered, people recognized it as the Darwinian mechanism rather than a Darwinian mechanism. Right. And so they literally defined heritability in genetic terms. Right. That was an error, because human beings are the most extreme case where the genes have offloaded the adaptive evolutionary work to another mode of heritability, which is our culture. And so people across academic disciplines will say, but that's, if you start speaking about human behavior in evolutionary terms, they will say, oh, but that's culture. As if they have just said that is not evolutionary, when in fact, culture abides by the same evolutionary principles with some modification. Culture can be changed moving horizontally. Genes always move vertically, though culture is mostly passed vertically as well. But the point is, the reasons that humans are capable of niche switching is because this job of adaptation has been largely removed from the genome and placed into the cultural apparatus so that it can be modified through time very, very rapidly. It is no less evolutionary, it is no less biological than the genes in our cells. It is a separate mode of inheritance. And once you see that, you realize that all of the expensive patterns of behavior that we can name from antiquity have to be the product of adaptive evolution. It may not be obvious why we have religions, but it is very obvious that human beings are investing a tremendous amount in this process, and that if it were not valuable, it would be very easy for people who just simply didn't bother to outcompete those who were spending so much on this process. So recognizing that religion, that small talk, that music, that humor and laughter, that all of these things are screaming at us that they are evolutionary products, but they are not telling us what purpose they are serving. That's the job we should focus on. What is it that has supported humor for all of the history of humanity? Why do humans spend so much time making instruments and gathering and singing together? What job is that doing, and how has it changed in the present? So the last thing I'll say on that topic is, as much as we can look back at any of these long-standing, expensive processes and say they are the product of adaptive evolution, even if their purpose is mysterious, you cannot do that in the present. We cannot look at Facebook and say, look at how much we are spending on this process. It is valuable because it hasn't yet stood the test of time, and probably it won't. So the amount of noise in the present is tremendous. But looking backwards, the farther you go, the more broad spread of behavior is, the more certain we can be that it was created by Darwinian evolution acting at the cultural level, and that we must therefore not worry about whether it's a product of evolution, and worry more about in what way it served our ancestors, and whether we still need it, whether we have done something else that has supplanted it.
Looking at culture from this way, that it is a form of adaptation that has served a purpose, and perhaps an important one. Perhaps it's a purpose that we no longer need to be worried about, but still, Chesterton's fence, if we are removing it, we should be damned sure that we don't need it anymore. What I found nowadays is that part of the culture in the West, at least as I see it, has been has this sort of almost apologetic tone when it comes to the cultural inheritage of the past, and it seems like the dismantling of past taboos and past prejudices, which in many ways had atrocious consequences for various people. And in many ways, it is absolutely correct to get rid of some of the bigoted parts that people used to engage in. However, it seems that this process has been completely uncritical, and I do worry whether we are not actually removing something that served a particular purpose, albeit how imperfectly it served that purpose, and we're creating this vacuum that may be filled by something that may be perhaps far less noble than the traditions of the past. I would love to know what you think about that.
We are damned if we do and damned if we don't.
Right.
We do not live in the environment of our ancestors.
Yeah.
It is certain that we maintain a great many traditions that are not only no longer necessary, but are probably even incompatible with features of modernity.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the number of things for which we cannot precisely articulate the utility and are therefore tempted to dispense with them, that then turn out to have been playing a profoundly important role, I think is the far greater danger. So let's take one strange example. The modern sophistication that sex is just something people do, that what goes on between your ears is no one else's business, that if you wish to consume pornography, whatever your particular desires might be, why would anybody bother to interrupt something that has only cognitive impacts? Well, the problem is that actually sexuality is a mystery. And we know, that is to say, we scientifically are still early days in terms of understanding how people's approach to their sex roles, their interactions with their partners, how these things are built. And the interaction that young people have with pornography is changing their nature and, most importantly, their relationships to each other. Right? This tool, clearly, the evolutionary record is clear. The fact that human beings enjoy sex when they are not fertile is a extremely rare characteristic. The fact that we continue to enjoy sex after menopause, the fact that sex is enjoyed when not at the place in the menstrual cycle where reproduction can happen, what this is telling us is that evolution has given humanity a gift. And the gift is a sexual bonding mechanism between individuals. But if you take that thing and you treat it as recreation, and you think it's just a matter of stimulating neurons, and anything that excites you is valid, then the point is you actually alter who you are, and then when you form a relationship with somebody, you bring that with you. You're actually damaging the person with whom you are going to spend your life in partnership. It's a foolish thing to do. But again, even that explanation that I just give, it's crude. It is certainly imprecise, and it will be difficult for people to know in what way it should interfere or not with their own consumption of pornography. And I would also point out that this is a classic case where you have two things that look alike. Right? Pornography I regard as utterly dangerous. This is not an argument against erotic content. Erotica is an ancient thing, right? It has existed long into antiquity, and the difference is the interference of the market. Pornographers' desire to sell you sexual content is inherently going to drive them into the extreme, because they're in competition with each other. And how do you get somebody's attention? You have to do something that hasn't been done before. So there's an arms race in pornography towards extreme violence, breaking every taboo. And this is not good for people. So the real question is not, should people be looking at erotic content if they feel like it? The question is, who generated it and why? And is it good for you, or was it good for them at an expense to you and your future partner?
And with regard to the abandonment of cultural truths that people have enjoyed before, one thing that we have alluded to here but haven't said explicitly is that one of the main theses of the book is that the rate of change itself is changing so fast that it is outpacing even humans' superior ability to niche switch,
Right.
to in fact adapt to the environment which we ourselves are creating out from under us, right? We're creating a conveyor belt that is just moving ever faster, and so the fact that it is our own creation doesn't make it any easier for us to deal with. And so that the hyper-novelty of the 21st century is a result of the pace of change, as opposed to the fact that we are changing our environments. Right. Our software, our incredible ability to change our environments, to transform the places, both literal and metaphorical, where we live, has always been a feature of humanity. It may be, in fact, the defining feature of humanity. And so culture changes. Everything from language to the smallest little thing changes. And creoles exist, and hybridization between cultures exist, and this has always been the case, and has been, sometimes terrible, but often exalting and amazing. It is the move to abandon all things in the past, which is just naive, or to say, we're just going to, combine these things from wildly different places, and let's just let the fireworks fly. Let's let the fireworks fly. Let's let the fireworks fly, and we don't care what happens. This is an error. This is forgetting that we actually have a history with a trajectory, and imagining that anything is possible in the future is a mistake of, honestly, liberalism. We can be in favor of progress and not make the error of saying, therefore, anything we come up with is good.
Right.
That when you say it that way, it seems obvious, right? Yeah. Obviously, not every human thought is a good one. So why then should we throw out everything from the past and let anyone's thoughts about what comes in the future survive?
Yeah, if I draw on your example of pornography, it seems to be fair, I'm quite surprised how. What a sort of taboo topic this is, because I think everybody recognizes this. And when you look at the stats, we've got a growing number of 30-year-old men who've never had sex. We've got 20-year-olds who are having erectile dysfunctions, and even considering how sort of sexually liberated we all are, when you look at young people that actually don't engage in sexual activity as previous generations, which sort of goes against the prediction that would have been intuitive, at least to my mind. And one thing that you mention, one concept that you invoke in the book, is this idea of sucker's folly, of even when almost everybody recognizes that something that we're doing is not exactly right, we sort of keep going with it, even though the benefits have been far exceeded by the detriments of that particular thing. How would you describe the sucker's folly?
Well, I think you just did it, right? The benefits of an action, if they are diffuse in maybe space, but especially in time, if the benefits will accrue over time, even if they are far greater than what can be gotten in the short term.
So I think you misspoke. You think the costs in the long term exceed the benefits in the short term. Doesn't matter. I think, but we have this discounting mechanism, and we have it for very good reasons. The fact is, we came, our lineages emerged from much more dangerous circumstances, and so it makes sense to prioritize the present over the future, because you may not live to see the future. But this problem, we now do tend to almost automatically live very long lives, and this discounting is now out of place. And it is very important for people to recognize that you cannot, in a complex system, unless you are taking great pains to track the long-term impacts of whatever it may be, whether it's a modification in your interaction with the environment, or it's a drug that your doctor tells you that you should be taking. Unless somebody is deliberately tracking the long-term implications of these things, the likelihood that there are costs which are not being tracked is extremely high. And this ought to create an intense bias of precaution, which is actually something Europeans have done much better than Americans. The precautionary principle is almost taboo in the US. And while I would argue that the American objection to it, which is that it is almost impossible to instantiate it well, the precautionary principle is not maybe inherently a guide to law so much as it is a philosophical principle, right? We will always be crude in our application of it. But the recognition that we are complex systems and that we live in a nested set of other complex systems, and our tinkering is going to have cascading consequences, most of which we cannot track, and therefore the risk we pose to ourselves is profound. That is a grave danger, especially with the rate of change being what it is, because even at the point that you discover what the consequences are, the situation that created them has moved on. It's 2 generations later, and it's impossible to keep up.
That's what I was just going to add. I did misspeak earlier, but the point of the sucker's folly specifically is that, sure, we know that we discount. We know that we don't tend to value as much problems in the future as benefits in the short term. But it actually is nearly impossible to know how to do it when the rate of change is so high. When we can't imagine, when we have no way of knowing what it will look like in a year, then that becomes an excuse not to think about costs that are downstream.
In fact, it has created what we have called the senescence of civilization. And the shocking thing about...
Could you explain what senescence is?
Sure. Senescence is a technical term for growing more feeble and less efficient with age. So in common parlance, people often say aging, but aging is not a good enough term, because something, this glass on the table, it could be 100 years old and it wouldn't be any less good as a glass than it was the day it was made. A person, a creature isn't like this. And so senescence is the process of degradation with time, and interestingly, it does not begin at birth. It begins at the first stage of reproduction of the creature in question. Genes have to do multiple jobs. We call this pleiotropy, because there aren't enough genes for a gene for each job to be uniquely done. That means that there will be many cases in which a gene or a genetic system provides a benefit early in life at a cost borne later in life. And selection views such genes favorably, because very often a creature will get the benefit early in life and not live long enough to suffer the cost later, or if they do, it matters less because they've done most of their reproduction or all of it. So this creates a system in which the genome accumulates things which provide early life benefits at late life costs. And the solution to the problem that this obviously causes is to produce a next generation. So you get old and die, but you've left a generation that is still young. The problem is that that same mechanism, really almost exactly, exists in civilization, where, even just take it economically, things that provide a benefit in the short term at some cost later, even if the cost of that process is 20 times the benefit that was initially accumulated, will tend to be reinforced and will be accumulated into society. So we are doing many things that will harm us later, but provide an economic benefit to somebody in the short term. And as these things accumulate, they guarantee that our society will become brittle and it will be destroyed. But what we don't have is a mechanism that would cause it to give birth to a young society that would replace it. And this is a grave danger. I believe people need to focus on this, because if you pay attention to what's going on in the world, it looks an awful lot like a creature decohering.
If I was actually thinking how to segue the next question, and I think I found a way, because I wanted to ask you about religion, or about old traditions again, because it seems that some part of the old traditions of wisdom, and they don't need to be necessarily religious, but many of them were, presented a sort of counterweight against this perhaps instinctive drive to prefer short-term benefit over long-term costs, because in a week we may be dead. But say religions that promise an afterlife where everything is glorious, they almost, it's what, I don't know if you would agree, but it seems to me that they in a certain way promote delayed gratification in this sense. And so that's the segue. But what I wanted to get to was that it was another point of surprise for me, because you, as evolutionary biologists, you actually don't have a strictly rejective view when it comes to religion, which to me is surprising, because I grew up on reading Richard Dawkins, who definitely does have that. And you use the phrase that religions may be literally false but metaphorically true. What does this mean? How to think about that?
The evolutionary content of our culture and our belief systems is there for a purpose that we can pretty well describe. That purpose is not an accurate understanding of the universe. An accurate understanding of the universe is a component of success. It is one way to accomplish things. But any belief structure that causes you to behave in a way that gives you an advantage should be reinforced. And so let's take the example that you just gave, the afterlife. And let us just say that from our perspective, the likelihood that there is a literal afterlife is vanishingly small. However, a person who lives according to the idea that there is an all-knowing being that sees everything that you do, that is keeping track of when you have done the right thing and when you have done the wrong thing, and upon your death will deliver you a reward greater than anything conceivable, or a punishment greater than anything conceivable, or condemn you to live between them for some period of time. That restructures the incentives of the individual so they don't become solipsistic, right? So they don't become hedonistic. Now, what is the consequence of such a belief? Let's say it's not true. Well, if you live in such a way that in God's view you are a righteous enough person to enter heaven, let's say, well, it is very likely that you will do right by the people around you who just so happen to share your genes, and that in doing this, the people who share the maximum quantity of genes with you, that is to say your own offspring, will be well positioned in their community. They will be well liked. People will remember fondly their parent. And so the point is there an afterlife? Kind of. Your genes will be passed on. And mind you, you shouldn't care about your genes. The genes care about nothing else. But you, as a human being, can recognize that your children carry your genes into the future, that you do care about their well-being. And the best thing that you can do from the point of view of how your children will be positioned is to live in such a way that if there was a God, that God would feel favorably towards you. So it is an analogy. Heaven is not a real place, but it is analogous to something that you can't really even describe until you have a word for gene, which we've only had, for a century. So it's a metaphor. And that metaphor, if you live as if it were true, you outcompete someone in genetic terms who lives according to the fact that it is false. It is metaphorically true, but literally false.
If I may give an example from farther afield, one with which probably none in your audience have direct experience, which I think will make it even easier to recognize the literal falseness of the belief, but the metaphorical truth, which emerges into Western understanding mostly after the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 off the west coast of Java, which created an earthquake underwater in the Indian Ocean, which created tsunami that in some places was 80, 90 feet tall, and just destroyed communities around, especially the eastern and northern part of the Indian Ocean. But there were some communities that, despite being right in the middle of the area that was most destroyed, did not have any deaths. And so the Moken people in the Andaman Islands survived, even though other people living there did not. And when asked afterwards what they did and why, they said, well, we know that because our ancestors have told us, because these are stories that are carried down from our elders, that when the seas recede, which is what happens before the tsunami comes, when the seas recede, that is God telling us that the gods are angry, and that what we must do is retreat from the sea, because the sea gods are angry. Most people who understand themselves to be modern in the West do not believe in sea gods. We think of ourselves as beyond that, right? But the many Westerners, for instance, who were tourists in places like in other places in the area that was destroyed, had no such beliefs, had no such ancestors who had told them about the sea gods who were angry, and so found it interesting when the seas receded, and when the seas came rushing back with a force that no human could deal with, they were washed out to sea and they were destroyed. Whereas those who believed in the sea gods who were angry survived. Now, are we saying that there are literally sea gods? Quite not. The actual belief is literally false, but it created a metaphorical truth. When the sea recedes, go to the hills, that allowed people to survive. So, Bret's example is more relevant to most people in the West, because most of us emerge from religions that have things like an afterlife, a singular God, and such. But it can be harder to see. It can be harder to parse the literal, false, and metaphorical truth of something when you are embedded in it. And so, we can find examples across all religions where the belief can seem obviously false to us, but with the distance of us not being in that culture, we can see that it has value.
And in that case, the myth of the lagoon that the Moken have was necessary because the periodicity of tsunamis in that area is far too long for living memory to have conveyed it in literal terms. So it is interesting. It shows us that the people who were descended from a narrow scientific materialist tradition, who could tell you the sea floor slips, that water does not compress, and that this means that if the water recedes, it has to rush back, and that you should retreat to the hills, didn't know what they were looking at. They hadn't been there long enough. There wasn't a built-up tradition. It was, in fact, only through a story that was contagious enough to be retold over that period of time where it wasn't being reinforced that the Moken literally all survived. It's an incredible demonstration. I would add just one more trivial one so that people can see how broad this concept is. The idea in sport that you must follow through after hitting the ball is poised right on the edge here. It does not matter if you follow through after you have hit the ball. It matters that you...
Sorry, what does follow through mean?
Follow through. You continue your swing
in
after
baseball.
you have hit the baseball or tennis or anywhere. If you swing so that the moment of impact is what you're focused on, you won't do it well. If you swing so that you carry through on the other side, it works beautifully. It is not because there's any impact of what you do after you've hit the ball that matters. It's entirely on the preparation side, but we say it's important that you follow through. That is just a linguistic way in which we say something that is false if you think carefully about it, but behaving as if it's true is essential, right? You can't be good at these games unless you do it.
I have to mention the contrast that it brings to my mind because, say, around 2016, 2017, one of the two books that made quite a big splash was Hans Rosling's Factfulness and Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, who are essentially this sort of the evangelist that everything is going just fine, and the only reason why we have doomsayers is because of our cognitive biases that are pushing us towards negativity, and if it bleeds, it leads, and sort of media bias. And I was completely buying that story, and I was convincing everybody who was even at that time quite worried that it's just going to be fine. It's just this, it's our twisted perception of reality. I don't believe that anymore. I mean, and I think, and I've seen many people who have made that switch. And in your book, there is quite a powerful appeal not to be complacent in these times. So one thing I wanted to ask you about what your outlook is for the future at the moment, because there is something up, and it's not looking well. And the other thing is, I don't know if you have it in the book or I heard it in one of your podcasts, is that because in Pinker's book, what he mentions is that people have always been saying that the world is ending, right? And it has never ended. So, let's not pay attention to the doomsayers. But you do actually have quite an interesting counter argument to this. So that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. First of all, I think even if it were just simply true that people have always been saying the world's going to end, they will be saying it right before it does. So it's not a completely compelling argument even on its face.
Right.
But really the more important point is, yes, the world has ended many times, but it tends to end. Most populations have a term for themselves. If we look at the Kalahari Bushmen, for example, the Kalahari Bushmen refer to themselves as the people. Mm-hmm. From the perspective of this lineage, this ancient lineage, their worldview is constructed as if the Kalahari are the world and everything else is a backdrop to it. So when we talk about the world ending, there are different ways that it can end. Your population can go extinct, or your population could have its way of life destroyed and the people could be atomized across the landscape to devastating effect, but not to extinction. There are many ways the world can end, and it has done so many times. So the fact that there is this predisposition to look for that danger is actually, I'm not saying that everybody who makes this claim is wise. They aren't. Most of them are fools. But the idea that we should be on the lookout for things that suggest that we are about to reach an event horizon beyond which our population is unlikely to persist, that is a wise thing to be on the lookout for. And we are in a very different position than any human population has ever been in. The interrelationship of human beings, the simple number of people on the planet, the rate of consumption of the population of the people on the planet, the fact that the ways in which that consumption are arranged are clearly unsustainable, and most importantly, the ferocious nature of the weaponry at our disposal presently means that to the extent that there is something that has ended populations before or has destroyed cultures before, we are not talking about it happening to a population. We are talking about potentially dragging the entire world into that ending scenario and not recovering. And even worse, the way that our story as human beings might end, either as the result of the use of nuclear weapons as some population faces its extinction, or as a result of our neglect of the fact that we have enabled civilian nuclear reactors, that there are 400 of them on Earth today, and that they require constant vigilance to keep them cool enough not to melt down. To the extent that civilization comes apart on us, we are not only likely to destroy ourselves, but we are likely to take out much of the portion of the Earth that we might naively imagine will take our place and recover.
I would just add that Pinker's work, with which I'm more familiar, would seem to suffer from precisely the reductionism and the sucker's folly that we have just been talking about. That the rate of change is happening so fast, and pointing to fewer people in poverty and lower crime rates and the likes, the kinds of statistics that are trotted out by people who correctly identify that there have been improvements to things like quality of life and health, especially since, say, the turn of the 19th to 20th century, right? The Industrial Revolution did a tremendous amount of good for many people at the same time that it set us on pathways that we are going to have a very hard time untangling ourselves from. And a focus on what is happening right now, looking into the past and presuming, and this is the presumption I think is almost always unstated, what happened before has to be the thing that will happen in the future. That it assumes this linear trajectory of we are now on such an upslope that we can do nothing but continue on the upslope. And the model is deficient. The model does not include problems like 400 nuclear reactors that require active engagement and so cannot withstand a solar flare that takes out the grid for 6 months. It cannot withstand that.
Which happened in the 19th century, right?
It was a Carrington event. Yeah.
Right. So, and that's just one example. Yeah. We are too intertwined. We are too global, and many of the improvements have meant that there are many more of us who want all of the benefits that industrialization have brought. Not all of us. In the West, we are relatively few who actually have most of the benefits. And if you actually try to spread those across everyone, suddenly those statistics look very, very different.
I would add something that we did not cover extensively in the book that I think should be on people's minds here. There are two bases on which you might organize civilization. One of them is truly ancient. In fact, it's so evolutionarily ancient that it's wrong to even think of it in human terms. Humans are late arrivers. And it has to do with collaboration based on genetic relatedness. So this is the stuff of lineage. And it is a very robust mechanism for creating collaborative alliances. Blood is thicker than water. Right. Then there is the West, and the West is based on the principle of reciprocity. And what this says is that if you put aside who is most related to whom, and you collaborate with people on the basis that they bring something to the collaboration that enriches you both, what you do is you end up creating a tremendous amount of wealth. You end up being more creative and insightful. It creates a society that is fairer, that is safer, that is more liberated. It is superior in every way. But it is fragile. And the problem that we are seeing, and I think many have become aware of it, although not in these terms, in October here as a result of events in the Middle East. The problem is that as much as the Western version of collaboration is far superior in every regard that we should honor, it is less stable. And when it breaks down into lineage against lineage displacement. And the world stands poised to be dragged backwards into that prior order, and we will lose the gains of the West. And then, unfortunately, because we have built up all of the weaponry that we have, we cannot endure an indefinite pattern of lineage against lineage displacement, because as lineages face extinction, they will defend themselves, and they will defend themselves with weapons that will jeopardize humanity as a whole. So that danger ought to be on people's minds, and we really must invest whatever it takes to, if we cannot stabilize the West, we will have to reinvent it. It is the only alternative to a tragic end for our species.
It's difficult to react right after that warning, but one thing that, at least to me, is intertwined with the idea of the West is democracy, of the idea of a free society. And this is something that you don't talk about in the book, but I wanted to ask you about, because that's the main focus of the Institute, because we do feel quite an intense sense of urgency about the future of free societies, because many people have been long talking about the so-called crisis of democracy. There are many different indicators saying that it is worsening year by year, and it is not just it feels like it's not just bumps on the road. There's something going on, and one idea that strikes me is that democracy is built essentially on two pillars. The first pillar is the institutions that keep it in check, and they stabilize it, or at least protect it against wilder swings of the pendulum. But more importantly, it is based on the underlying culture, because if the culture changes, it is only a matter of time before the institutions fall as well. And having, looking at what we've just talked about, even looking at Chesterton's fence about the phenomenon of hyper-novelty, the danger of the world disintegrating into a interlineage struggle once again. How should we take these lessons and bring them to bear when it comes to trying to improve democracy or even the idea of the West?
There are a couple places that you have to look. Your question is unanswerable. We talk in the book about the need to get over the idea that one can blueprint a society, and we have to move to the idea that what you can do is navigate in the direction of a society, that you can prototype and then very carefully monitor the consequence and improve the prototype sequentially, the way you would design a rocket or a machine. And this is important because we can't foresee what happens. The prototypes teach you. And so your question is unanswerable in the present, but there are some places that we should focus in terms of pointing in what direction to navigate.
Let me just interject here for a moment that this returns us to the metaphor of the adaptive landscapes to which you referred earlier, that you can look at this higher peak and know that you're going to have to go down slope. You're going to have to lose some things before you can ascend a peak that you might be able to imagine is better, but you don't actually know what's there and you don't know how to get there. The climbing will have to happen as the climbing happens. And so we need to get onto the slope and then discover as we go.
Yes, and it is disturbing. We have realized the adaptive landscape, if we put it on the board in the classroom, looks like a little mountain range. Yeah. That's actually too comforting. The problem is these mountains are separated. It's like an archipelago of little islands sticking out of a sea, and it's in the fog. So it's perfectly possible to leave your peak for good reason and be 3 degrees off and miss the peak that you should be climbing. So which direction to navigate is essential. And one, it is crucial to understand that there are really only 2 bases on which good governance could emerge. One of them is the consent of the governed being the sole basis of legitimacy for governance, and the other being impossible in the present, which is, the idea of a good king who is motivated both by the need to keep the subjects well enough protected and housed that they do not rebel, or maybe because he has some innate sense of lineage. The fact is we're too intermingled and too dangerous to each other for that second category to work. So we are stuck with some version of democracy, but our democracies are completely incoherent, and they're completely incoherent. Completely, for 2 reasons that I see. Maybe there are more, but one of them is that the scale is incomprehensible. So, for example, the people of the world have a profound interest in the outcome of American elections, and they have no vote. So to the extent that one believes in democracy because of the consent of the governed, the world is more governed by the United States than you would imagine based on the fact that most people have no influence on our elections. And we, inside the United States, discover that we have almost no influence on our elections either, that we have the pretense of it, that we have elections, but there's a game.
Because of the primaries and
yes.
pre-process.
All of the good candidates are eliminated in the primaries, and then maybe it is possible for us to choose among the bad candidates who are left at the point we get to the general election, and that's been the pattern for a very long time. So we have a problem, which is that even if you believe in democracy in a theoretical, philosophical way, the way it maps onto the globe is utterly incoherent. So that's bad. But then there's the other process, which is in our minds, there's a relationship between democracy and capitalism. And it's not a false relationship. The fact is these are both mechanisms that are built around freedom, the freedom of people to choose their leadership and their direction of travel, and the freedom to provide value to the world and get paid for it. The problem is that the process, that unfettered capitalism, is such an utterly powerful process that just as the West is vulnerable to breaking down into lineage versus lineage displacement, democracy is vulnerable to being overridden by the market. And that is in fact what's happening. And, I'm a little bit, dare I say, heartened to find that there are institutions in the Czech Republic that still function, because inside the US, and we've talked extensively on our podcast about this, there appear to be no functional institutions above a very tiny size. Really none. You have functional individuals, but the institutions have all been captured and hollowed out and have become at best listless, at worst hostile to the interests of the population they're supposed to serve. And this is a result, it may not be the only force, but it is primarily the result of economic forces having overwhelmed the democratic impulse to govern ourselves well and in a reasonable direction.
I've just realized that we've been way over time than I had imagined, but I want to end on a hopeful note and give you the opportunity to tell us about a fantastic idea in the book, and that's the fourth frontier, because that is really something that I had never heard anything like that. I actually discovered that because when our founder articulated what the H21 vision was, it was sort of a bit cloudy, bit vague, and I was looking for some concrete substantiation, how to give it some principle, how to give it some logic, and the fourth frontier was the closest thing and the most sophisticated thing that I could find. So I'm actually using it to tell people how to understand the H21 concept. But what is it? What is the fourth frontier, and what are the preceding three frontiers?
Let me do the setup, and
sure.
then you explain fourth frontier. So fourth only makes sense if there are three others. Right. And when you say frontier to people, usually they think geographic frontier, discovery of a new landscape. And that is certainly, those were the earliest frontiers, and those are what we still think of usually, but we're done until and unless we find a new planet, which will have all sorts of problems of its own. Humans have expanded into all of the landscapes that we can really inhabit. So that's the first. The second frontier is a technological one, in which we create through innovation things where there was not opportunity before. So agricultural spaces, like the terracing of steep slopes, where you can now grow things and eat them, and there was nothing to be done with that land before. The third kind of frontier is, we say in the book, one that has been used widely but is not legitimate. It is theft. It is what we call transfer of resource, wherein one population comes, and maybe they thought they were experiencing a geographical frontier, comes into a landscape where it turns out it is already inhabited. And instead of turning around or finding a new space, they take it from the people who were there first, or second or third. The people who are there now, they take it from them. So that's a transfer of resource frontier. And while the first two are legitimate, and one might even say honorable, or at least they can be honorable, the third is never honorable. But it has described much of human history. So if we're out of first frontiers, and technological frontiers continue to exist, but we can't predict to what degree they will continue to enable us to escape from our own limits, and resources are finite. And the third type of frontier is illegitimate. What are we left with?
So let me just add that the way to think about frontiers is that these are mechanisms of generating growth. And growth is identified as an economic term, but that's not, it's more fundamentally a biological term. And human beings, like all creatures, are obsessed with growth. They're looking for an opportunity that is unexploited or underexploited. And the response to this is that populations grow when they find a frontier. So the third frontier is especially dangerous because our addiction to growth means that when there are no more landscapes to find and the technology, there hasn't been a revolution in some time, the people are hungry for growth, they face austerity, and they're looking for some way to generate that growth. The idea that there might be people who have resources that they cannot defend is an irresistible attractor. So people will generate an excuse for going after a population. This is the reason that we have so much warfare, genocide. So it must be avoided, right? Our addiction to growth leads to genocide if we don't provide some mechanism for feeding that addiction that does not require this. The fourth frontier is the idea of a steady state. Now, a steady state is an equilibrium. It is an equilibrium that can exist because we can input energy to it. So, you know, the water in your toilet tank maintains a level because it has an energy source, the pressure of the water, and so it's at an equilibrium that is a steady state. It is conceivable to make a steady state for humans that gives the people the experience of growth without requiring a constant supply of external growth. So this may sound like magical thinking, it may sound like utopianism. It's the opposite. Yeah. Utopianism is probably the worst impulse that human beings have. But just the same way that inside of your house you have spring-like temperatures all year, it doesn't violate any laws of physics. You know, we can cool your house by warming your backyard. It all adds up properly. But the point is, it gives you the pleasant spring feeling all year long. We can't blueprint, but we can navigate to a steady state for human beings that provides them the feeling of growth that would liberate them, that allows us to choose between these two modes, allows us to choose this Western, cosmopolitan, tolerant mode over lineage against lineage displacement. And the key thing is that this would have to be built with an input, just the same way that your spring temperatures in your house are maintained with the use of energy. We would have to have a source for this. Yeah. Something, for example, like zero-point energy or the discovery of viable fusion could allow us to give human beings the sense of being in a perpetually abundant environment, even though the fluctuations on the outside of that society were sometimes negative. And the problem, I will point out, is that if you were to find an energy source at the moment that allowed this, but were to deliver it into a system in which the institutions are broken, in which democracy is not functional, it would almost certainly make problems worse. Fusion would become a weapon, an economic weapon, not a mechanism for rescuing humanity from the calamity to which it is headed. So it is important not to wait until that technology arrives, but to plan for it so that at the point we get there, we understand we mustn't squander the opportunity of creating a fourth frontier, a perpetual state of seeming abundance, right? We must not squander that, because it is really the only hope of rescuing the Western values that actually would allow all of the populations of the earth to continue in an indefinite fashion.
Is it just a stable state of abundance, but do we actually need the sense of growth within it? Like, is it, because it seems to me that it's, people talk about the hedonistic treadmill.
Yeah.
Like whenever you reach a new state of comfort, it becomes boring and you're reaching for something else. And I do wonder whether, again, going back to the older traditions, whether there were these proxies that sort of almost simulated a sense of growth, in the sense that they attempted to cultivate wisdom or the connection to a higher power, or the cultivation of a particular place that was seen as a symbol of something higher. So you had this perpetual, like I can imagine a gardener who tends a garden every single year. It is cyclical, but he's got this feeling that he's participating in something greater, right? Does that resemble, or does that fit into the idea of the fourth frontier?
Yes, and indeed, I think gardening is a terrific example. Also, I think that we have in the book the example of craftsmanship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Of having a trade, whether or not it's your actual trade or not, but having a skill in which you put a lot more time than you technically need to in order to have something functional, in order to make something beautiful as well. Something that you might then pass on to your own children or your friends. Something that, I want a table. I just need a place to put my glass. Okay, well, you can go to IKEA and get that, right? Or you can spend a lot more time than you technically need to, and you have the sense of adding value to the universe, even though you have the same level of functionality you would have had you not spent the time.
So we actually, it's speculative, but we believe that we see evidence of this in the ruins left to us by the Maya. And the Maya are a very special example of a culture. The Maya, interestingly, were not destroyed by the Spaniards. So we can see more or less their entire arc in their history. But what they did, so you have a 3 millennium history for the Maya. And the Maya we know because the Maya had a written language invented entirely independently of the languages of the old world. We know that they actually measured time in units of 400 years called the Baktun. So they were they were thinking long into the future, and we believe we know that they ultimately came apart. Though the people still exist, the culture came apart as a result of the fact that they had actually pulled off a trick that is almost impossible to imagine, even with our chemical sophistication and our agricultural sophistication. They farmed fragile tropical alluvial soils in a way that was very nearly sustainable, that allowed them to go through millennia of doing this, which we could not. Our exploitation of these things would have ruined those soils very rapidly, and we would be forced to use fossil fuel inputs. They had a very sophisticated mechanism for agriculture. But in any case, the point is, we look at what they've left, and if you travel in Mayan country, which I recommend that everyone do, you see these incredible monuments. The structures of people's houses are gone, long since swallowed by the jungle. But these incredible, it's not even pyramids. You think it's pyramids because those are the most conspicuous elements, but it's actually pyramid complexes that stretch for miles through the jungle. What were they doing? Why would you invest in buildings that do not produce anything? And interestingly, unlike the Egyptian temples, these structures actually are onion-like. They were built up over time by these civilizations. And what Heather and I interpret this as meaning is that there was a mechanism of intensive investment in public works. Now, the thing about intensive investment in public works is that its product is not obvious. Just as we say, you look at music, what is all this expense for? Well, it's obviously for something very important because every culture has it and we spend a lot of time doing it. Well, what were these gigantic monuments for? Well, these monuments, emphasized to the people, these people who had time periods of 400 years that they commonly spoke of, it emphasizes to them that they are part of something very durable and long-term, right? It schedules the position in the universe of the public mind, and very crucially, we think, in years where the crops underproduce, where the weather is not conducive to producing the usual amount of food, you won't have as many mouths to feed because you've invested an awful lot of energy each of the good years in expanding these giant temple complexes. So the ability to not add to the temples this year but have nobody starve is a stabilization mechanism. So from the point of view of, if you think about the weather contributing to the growth of the agricultural product, and the weather, is capricious, well, this is a mechanism for reducing the impact of the capricious weather on the people, which would then cause them to have these very durable societies. So really, we do not have the institutions to support this. Public works projects would almost certainly, at least in the US, be squandered on what we call boondoggles, right? Where people would use them to enrich their friends, and it would be meaningless. But if we were to take an understanding of our vulnerability and the necessity that we understand ourselves as something cohesive, and that we understand our long-term well-being as uncertain, and that it requires investment, and we were to take the surplus of our society and invest a large fraction of it in some sort of public works that helped to make us into a culture that functioned properly and that could be backed off so that we did not have these intense periods of austerity that caused people to go after each other, that begins to look like a solution to the problem that may in fact be a reinvention of what the Maya were doing.
So if I understand it correctly, it can sort of be seen as an antidote against the sucker's folly, right? Because these humongous, majestic buildings remind you that there were people thousands of years before you who came, and that it doesn't end this year, but this civilization will continue. When there's a good year, you can use it to celebrate this fact and build another foundation or another floor of this pyramid. But in a bad year, it also reminds you that it shouldn't. There shouldn't be any strife because you're here for the long run, right? You're not here to harvest the short-term benefits. That is actually quite interesting. Sort of the fact that these buildings also have a symbolic value that remind you that the mere existence here and now, that at times can be full of suffering, is something that is happening within a context of something greater.
Something that will outlast you.
Yeah.
And I will say that there is a hint of this.
Something that will outlast you. That is important. I am a part of a something that will continue on. It is more of this, the literal description of what someone else might encode in an afterlife. But we even feel this here in Prague. It's very different from the US, where things are so new. And in fact, Heather and I have become quite fascinated with the things in North America that aren't new. The native populations are a much more fascinating topic than many people realize. The huge range of cultures, the number of things that these people invented independently of the examples in the old world is staggering. But the European-derived population and the Africans that they imported as slaves built a society in which nothing's really very old. And that has a corrosive effect on our understanding of who we are. Here in Prague, you're looking at buildings that do say something at least about a period of hundreds of years, and it changes the mindset, whereas looking at buildings that are 50, 100 years old does not have that impact. And the respect with which we treat ourselves, I think, is distinct. If you look at, Americans have allowed themselves to become physically sick. We invest nothing in the architecture of most new structures. They're,
It's even worse than, Soviet brutalism. It's just completely uninspired
We've
boxes.
got that here also.
Yes, but just the simple fact that you encounter these marvelous structures, I believe it actually changes the mindset substantially, and we underappreciate how important it is.
Well, I certainly hope that we will reinvent the old ways, or at least find a way how to renew the ideal of the West, because I believe that it has been one of the most noble, concept or systems of ideas, and I do worry that we're losing the grip on what it once meant. Heather and Bret, thank you so much for coming here. It's been a pleasure. I would love to talk for many more hours, but unfortunately we have to go to another interview. So thanks a lot once again.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thanks, this was fabulous.